there are different types of objects in R, and it's important to understand at least the basics of some of the key ones. I'm not going to spend much time going into the details of all of these different object types, but I do want to explain to you a couple of them. So the first one is called a vector. And so what I've just done here is use the pound sign, or hashtag, if you will, and I've typed the word vectors after it. This is called a comment, and this is really important when you're writing code in R. You should always comment your R scripts very well. It allows you to create headings and just make notes as to what your code is actually doing. And here I'm just using it as a heading. So a vector is kind of the basic and probably most important object type in R. A vector is basically just a list of values. It can be a list of numbers, a list of letters or words, a list of true or false values. And these respectively are called numeric vectors, if it's just a string of numbers, character vectors, if it's a bunch of letters or words, and logical vectors, if it's a series of true or false values. So if I wanted to create an object called vec1, and I want to assign a series of numbers to it, I have to use a function which is called the concatenate function, which is just the letter C here, and then you open parentheses after it, and inside the parentheses you put all of the different values that you want your object to contain. So here I'm taking the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I'm concatenating them, or combining them, into one string of numbers, and then I'm assigning that series of numbers to the vec.1 object. If I run this code, now here in our environment we see that there is the vec1 object. Here it says NUM. That means that this is a numeric vector with 6 values, 1 through 6. You can see that right here. If I go and I type vec1 and I just return that, now in my R console in the bottom left, you can see the contents of vec1. Right? So this is a simple example of a numeric vector. We can also make a character vector. If I say vec2, use my concatenate function, and in quotes I type the words 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now I'm telling R that I want 6 different words, and the reason that R will interpret these as words is because they're in quotes. Anytime you see something in quotation marks, it's a word. It's a character, so to speak, in R. If I run this code, now I've got another object in my environment, vec2, which here you can see CHR, that stands for character. This is a character vector that is a length of 6, and it contains these objects. Again, if I run vec2, the output shows up down here in the R console. And finally, vec3, if I make something that is an example of a logical vector, will still be concatenating. And I can say true, true, false, true, false, false. And so here I've got the contents of this vector that I've now created. You can see in your environment that LOGI, this is a logical vector. Again, 6 values, true, true, false, and so forth. And same as always, if I run just that, it will return the output down there. Now you don't need to actually type the name of the vector as I've been doing here, of course. What you could do is simply highlight the name of the object in your code and run it, and that will return the output down here. You can highlight by dragging your cursor across, or you can simply double click on the object and that will do the same thing. So it's important also to note that these objects that I'm creating, these vectors, can only contain one type of data. So for example, as a sample of a type of object that would fail if I try to create it as such, if I make an object that contains these values, a true, a number 1, and the word archaeology, and I run that, this will cause problems, right? And it looks like it ran, right? It sent the output down here. An object called vec_fail showed up in my environment, but the issue is that it actually, and it's tough to tell this unless you're used to looking at R, but what it did is actually interpret all of these things as words. So it no longer understands that this is a logical value, true, that this is a number 1, and this is the word archaeology. It thinks this is the word true, and it's treating this number 1 as a word. And the way that you can inspect this to see what exactly R has done here is if I use the str function. This stands for structure, and this is a really useful function for inspecting objects. If I type str and then open parentheses and put vec_fail in it and run that, you can see the output says chr. This means that R is interpreting this as a character vector, right? So it's defaulting, and it's still got all these values here, but now this is not a number 1. This is not a logical true. This is just the word true and the word 1, which is kind of silly. So it's important to keep in mind that these vectors all need to be the same type of data. Now, another thing that I want to talk about is called indexing. Whenever we have all of these objects that contain various values in them, sometimes we want to pull out specific values from within these objects. Indexing is how we do that. So if I type vec_1 here and run that, you can see that it's these numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. If I just wanted the second value, I want that number 2 out of this, what I can do is use indexing, which requires brackets. So these straight brackets here, if you hit the brackets button, and then I put the number 2 in the brackets, what this is saying is take the vec_1 object and pull out the second value from within it. So if I run that, I get the number 2. It's pulling out the second value of the vec_1 object. Right? If I were to say pull out the 4th value of the vec_1 object and run that, it pulls out the number 4, the 4th value there. If I do the same thing for the vec_2 object and I run that, it pulls out the word 4, which is the 4th. If you just double click vec_1 and run that itself without the indexing part, you can see all of vec_2, and by running vec_2 indexing for the 4th value, it's just pulling out the word 4, which is the 4th value of that object. So this is called indexing, and this is really important to get a handle on. This is going to allow you to pull out specific things from these objects, and sometimes objects can get quite complicated. So it's important to be able to know how to do this.